Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome again to another session of Let's Talk, the struggle of the believers. Yes, we know that there are many believers everywhere, especially in the Caribbean. I'm from Jamaica. I'm a Jamaican, and there are many believers there. Believers we refer to as persons who believe in God, persons who believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and this platform, this session, we will address one of the struggles that some believers face. So today we welcome you to this session and let's talk the struggle of the believer. This session we are going to look at a struggle that some believers they did not even think they would go through this struggle. They start out very good. They would have their home, even if they rent a place, which they call home. Many believers start out by renting a house or renting a condominium or renting a 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom home. That is fine. That is fine. But some of the believers, they started very good. And they, of course, they would have had jobs, and they would be living quite comfortable. But as time goes on, yes, they are active in church. Yes, they would lead the prayer line. Yes, they would be welcoming persons in the ministry. They would be very active. They would also be well known because they would, many of these believers, they are very approachable, well pleasant, and nice, and they're well okay. An outsider would say, okay, wow, this person is really progressing. Wow, this person looks flourishing. Wow, this person looks as everything is going all right and nice. And yes, there were times when they had some believers, they had a good time. They were very comfortable and everything was going fine. They had a nice vehicle and a nice vehicle, yes, a nice job, a nice house, etc., etc. They would be enjoying life. But as time goes on, some of the believers, they find that they start to struggle. They're not able to pay their bills. They're not able to keep up the payment for the vehicle, for example, and they start struggling. Yes, they would still give their tithes. They would still give their offering, tithes and offering. And yes, of course, they would still continue to go to church. Of course, they would still join the prayer line. They would still lead the prayer session, for example. They will still take part in the ministry. They would still do the moderation of the service, and they still work at the altar. Many of these believers, they have been active, but sometime in their lives, sometime in their day-to-day activity, they realize that they start to struggle, and they realize that they're not able to afford payment of the house, for example. To the house would be, they're not able to pay the mortgage, so they would say, okay, let me downsize to live in an apartment. When they get to the apartment, they realize after a while, they find that they're still struggling a bit. They're not able to pay the rent. And, if they're not able to pay the rent, 2 months pass, 3 months pass, and of course, the landlord, for example, would give them notice. Yes, would give them notice. And when they do get the notice, they realize there's nowhere to turn, but they end up living in somewhere that does not have a shower, that does not have a kitchen. No one, they can't invite anyone to come and see them, to visit them. They cannot dine around the dining table. They find that they have resorted to somewhere they call home, that anybody can pass by. They can even look at them. Look at where they are living, because they are no longer in a house. We're talking about some believers. We're talking about the struggles of some believers. Some of the believers, of course, for whatever reason, they are struggling. It is a fact. Many of these believers, they end up living in their vehicles. They live in their vehicles. This is a struggle that some believers face. We're talking about persons who, yes, they pray to God. They believe in the Lord. They'll tell you about the Lord. They have faith, but the fact is that they're struggling. They end up living in their vehicles. They end up living in their cars. Yes, and when they do live in their cars, you find that they will cover the glass with material or with cardboards or with something so as to hide the belongings that are in the vehicle. They end up living in their cars. This is one of the struggles that some believers face. Yes, and where do they park their vehicles? They would park their vehicles on the property, for example, even on a property of a motel, for example. Yes, because the motels are, no one is really noticing if they're coming out of the vehicles. There are many vehicles that stay overnight, so no one would really realize that this vehicle is parking here so many nights. No one would really realize that, notice it. But yes, they do struggle. Some of the believers struggle. They have to resort to living in their cars. Where do they shower? That's a question. Where do they shower? They will tell you, wow, I will go to a pool somewhere. I'll go to a community center somewhere. I'll go to a public place that I can do my little tidying up. Yes. Yes, so even if they have to use a washroom, where do they use a washroom? They have to go to a public place. They drive and go to a public place. But this channel talks about the reality, the real life of some believers. We're talking about believers who believe in God. They pray, but they are struggling. This is an area that we're looking at today. It's the struggle of the believer end up living in the cars. It is not a desirable struggle, but this is one of the struggle that believers face. This channel talks about the real struggle of believers. We're saying that many times the believers, they will come to church and they will appear as if they are nice and happy. They would appear that way as if everything is going fine. They will give you a nice smile. They will say, yes, I am happy. Yes, everything is doing well. How are you? I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Praise God. I'm doing well. They will say that, but behind that, they're not telling you. They're not telling you that they are struggling. They're not telling you that they have nowhere to stay. They're not telling you that they are living in their vehicles. They're not telling you that. They're not saying that to you unless they confide in you and say, I am struggling. Yes, I am struggling. There's this one particular lady, for example, I met recently, and that is where she is living, in her car. And she has been an intercessor for sure. She has been leading the prayer line for sure. She has been very active in the ministry, and yet she is struggling. We're talking about believers. Nothing is wrong with being a believer, but the fact is, we'll say that the Christian pathway, the believer's pathway is not an easy pathway. The Christian pathway is not an easy pathway. We're going to be faced with many challenges. This channel talks about the struggles of some of the believers. Do you know a believer who has been living in the vehicle? Do you know who did live in their vehicles, who spent a couple weeks, a couple months in their vehicles, not knowing if someone will be coming and looking at them, a person will be looking down on them. But it is a life of some of the believers. They live in their vehicles. Do you know someone who has that experience? Do you know someone who's actually living in the vehicles? Even sometimes they may have a chick or a child, and the child would also have to resort in living in their vehicles for whatever reason. Even if you're in the foreign land, for example, they may have they have used up all the government facilities, for example, government benefits, for example, and they're not no longer qualified to get some assistance, some government assistance, some financial assistance. All those benefits have been used up. We don't know the reason why, but the fact is they end up living in their vehicles. This channel let us know that there are believers who are struggling, and this is one of the struggles that we look at believers living in their vehicle they're not able to to have a home, to have a building, for example, like they're not able to pay the rent, pay the mortgage. They may not have relatives who can live with them, for example. We don't know whatever the reasons are. They may have a brother, they have a sister, and of course they may have tried to live with the brother, with the sister, and they some challenges came across and happened, and they end up going back to live in their vehicles. Do you know someone like that? Do you know someone who lived in the vehicle, or some persons who have been living in their vehicles for whatever reason, and these persons are believers? We thank you for joining. We thank you for listening this session. This session, as we say, we look at some of the struggles of the believers. We have also looked at previous struggles of the believers. We invite you to listen to some of the struggles that we have mentioned about. Some of the struggles you can relate to. Some of the struggles you may know persons who have been through this struggle. So we looked at various struggles so far, and we're saying that the believers, they do have a different struggles. Some struggles are not the norm. Some struggles we call them testings. Some struggles we call them, it's almost unrealistic. But these are some of the struggles that we look at today. We look at the struggle of not being able to afford a proper accommodation. So the believer would end up living in the car, on the road. Don't know exactly where he or she's going to park the vehicle tonight. Not sure where, how far, and if persons will realize that this vehicle has been parked there every night. Nowhere to take a shower, nowhere close. You have to go to the public place to take a shower, and to use a washroom, have to drive to use a washroom, or use some other means in the vehicle to make sure that they can sleep comfortable. Yes, so do you know someone who has been living in their vehicle? We're talking about the believers who have been struggling living in their vehicles. We thank you for joining this session, and we look forward to you joining in another session. You're free to like and subscribe and share this episode to someone you know who lived, a believer who lived in the vehicle, a believer who is living in their vehicle and very uncomfortable and maybe very private about it. Yes, the pride may not able to share, not comfortable to share that's where they're living, but this is a channel that we look at. Let's talk the struggle of the believer. Thank you for joining, thank you for sharing, thank you for subscribing, and join me in the other episode of Let's Talk the Struggle of the Believer. Thank you for joining. Have a great day.